What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the First Class Lacrosse podcast. We're filming after an incredible Final Four weekend for the men's and the women's. I'm joined by my co-hosts Stephen Rafis and Matt Dunn, and we're going to break down the weekend and really recap what was a great season. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Deemer.
What's up, guys?
Pretty simple segment breakdown today. As Deemer mentioned, we'll talk about men's and women's Final Four and championship games, and at the end, we'll talk about some recruiting advice from some really great webinars we had last week for our best-in-class registrants with Coach Adam Sear and Coach Sean Kerwin of Dartmouth. So excited to get into that towards the end.
Matt, you've been at training camp. Would love to hear some of your thoughts from first week so far at PLL camp, some of your thoughts around early season and anything else our listeners can expect as the season gets started this weekend.
Yeah, I am now about a week into the dorm life in Albany. So if you're watching this with video on, that is the background of the prison cell I'm currently in, is in Albany dorm, North Campus. But it's been fun, it's great to see everybody again after a long off season. I think the PLL does such a good job with all of the moving parts. Like, there's so much going on here, and they're continuously trying to innovate moving forward, and with summer schedules and things that conflict with tournaments each week and understanding how they can better get games on TV and different venues. One of the cool things they're talking about is Saturday night lacrosse. So if you look at the schedule, you'll see most weekends games are Friday and Saturdays with an afternoon game and a Saturday night game. So really just trying to get a premier game each Saturday night of each weekend that people can tune into on TV or go and attend after a day of events or camps or tournaments. Camp's been cool. We're about to talk about Final Four championship. We're already seeing these guys roll in, the Cornell guys, the Maryland guys, Penn State guys. The turnaround is different. Deemer in particular, remember the MLL days where you'd finish your college season and maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, you would join the MLL games. Seeing these guys showing up a day or two after winning or losing a championship or losing a Final Four game, it's impressive, but it's also really cool just to see some of these guys we've watched all spring up close and in person.
I'm not afraid to admit it, but one of my MLL stories in that June after our first summer was, especially coming off the season, my birthday was like third week of June. And I remember planning a trip to Vegas with a lot of our friends. And I just, in my opinion, I was like, I'm not going to miss this and like pass up on this experience, So like, I can't remember if I had missed a game or we had a bye. I remember you weren't on that trip, but it is fascinatingly, like, for the guys coming off their seasons, like, it's a hard turnaround, and you're coming right into training camp, and then seeing even the clips of Kelleher, Hugh Kelleher coming right off a national championship. He gets 1 or 2 days to celebrate with his teammates, and then he's out of there, transitioning. So it's not an easy turnaround, but I think it also speaks to how the PLL has really upgraded the experience, and what people are playing for, and they want to be there right away and do that, So I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
Well, I remember we were in California working a camp before that, and you guys went to Vegas, and I had, at that point, was going to play. We had a game that weekend for the Rochester Rattlers, and I was like, it's not my birthday. I should probably go to the game I'm supposed to be at. But yeah, Kyle Aldridge, who's a short stick defensive midfielder from Penn State. We're joking with him because he shows up, gets his medical in the morning, and he's at practice with us in the afternoon. And we're like, what were you doing 48 hours ago? Like they had just lost in the Final Four, and he's out there running transition drills with us, going early offense to defense, and literally just playing on the Final Four stage 2 days before. So it is a testament to these guys that they want to be in the league and they want to compete and make a team. And I give them a tremendous amount of credit for coming in off of that season. And a lot of these guys, how they're just showing up and they're plugging right into practice. They're grinding for a spot. They're working hard. They love the sport and just, being great teammates.
I thought there was a cool interview on CNBC this week with Paul, and he was getting interviewed around the state of the league, the state of the audience, and the growth of the league and how things have changed. And then there was one question from the interviewer around, are these career guys, are they guys that are, the weekend warrior or, so forth. But, you've seen it all over this last decade of, what it was, guys working other jobs to, now like more guys are trying to optimize to really make lacrosse full time. What kind of trends have you noticed in that? What kind of guys are having success? Is it still a range? Are you seeing any patterns emerge? I think it'd be helpful for people to hear, you know, is this full time? But also, like, what are people doing to really commit themselves to being a professional lacrosse player?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think Paul and Mike have spoken pretty candidly about what's on the roadmap in the future, at least to us. I don't want to share too much of that just because I'm not sure if it's public, but it's no secret that they want to get more and more people to consider lacrosse to be full time. And they have plans as how to do that. I think it all comes down to now, like how, like what's important to you. I think we're seeing more guys. Look, some people say like my career is really important. I played in college. I played 1, 2 years pro, and like it's just not for me, and that's fine. And they have a job in New York and they want to do that. But we see a lot of the opposite, and I'm seeing a lot of guys that take a New York job or something, and they're working really hard, similar to like what you did, Deemer, and they find it really hard to train the way they want to prepare the way they need to. And here's some of those guys like I'm thinking about like switching careers because I really want to play and I really want to be able to give this my all. I want to show up prepared. I want to be able to work on this and I want to be a great professional lacrosse player for as long as I can be. And that's important to them. And I think for more people, anecdotally, it feels like there's more people that feel that way and see a path to it being cool and exciting and something they aspire towards to having a long, successful professional lacrosse career. But to that point, it's not everybody. It's just what's important to you. Like nobody's making $1 million right now doing this, but people are making enough where it might make sense along with a few other things to really commit to it, which to me is exciting. I love it. And to play with guys that love it too is really important. I'd say it's a trend. You know, there was always some of that going on. Like you made that decision, Deemer, 8 years ago, maybe, where you had your Wall Street job and you love lacrosse and you wanted to invest into it. And that's kind of how first class lacrosse started too. I think you see just guys that want to follow what they love doing.
It's cool to see, excited for the season, wishing you the best as things kick off this weekend. Steve, why don't you kick us off for recapping some of the final four and let's get into some discussion here.
Yeah, so awesome weekend at the Final Four. I was there for the men's semifinals on Saturday. First game, Cornell 11, Penn State 9. Second game, Maryland 14, Syracuse 8. We'll dive into this first game here. Obviously, Cornell comes away with the win. Penn State did lead at half 5-4. It was a 6-6 game, middle of the third quarter. One of the more notable storylines was CJ Kirst held to 0 goals and 0 assists. Not a totally surprising performance as a whole from it being a tight game. Penn State, the only team to beat Cornell all year. Thought it was exciting. I ended up getting into the stadium like halfway through that third quarter, so it was able to watch most of the fourth. I know you guys said that you caught it as well. Any thoughts here that you guys have on it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Quint made a comment after the game, like Cornell just showed that they can win ugly. I don't know if they won ugly, or I would say that. I get why I said it because CJ Kurse had 0 goals. And I think when your best player has no points for the first time in what was it, 70, 60, 70 games or something like that. And that's the semifinal game you win by 2. Cornell's super well rounded and talented. And also, like, credit to Alex Ross, who covered CJ Kurse that game. Like, Alex Ross for Penn State is a guy that we've known and trained and had 2 events before. And he is a guy that I've been consistently impressed with. And I think probably doesn't get enough credit. And next year will probably be a guy that we see a lot of. But I mean, 2 guys that really stood out in that game. Kelleher, that was the first time I really appreciated the impact he can have. I think Penn State struggled at the pole position to match up with his size and athleticism. And even when they went zone, like his ability to stretch it at times put a lot of pressure on their defense. And we talked about Waldman, number 3, having an impact from maybe not being one of those first 6 guys that everybody was talking about throughout the season to being an impact player and being able to score goals. And we even saw that in the championship. So, yeah, I think it just showing Cornell's culture is a big thing that Michael Long and CJ Kurse talked about with us, and like them just finding a way to win when maybe it's not CJ Kurse having a 7-point game.
Yeah, going off that, another guy on that second midfield, I believe, was Brian Lutzy. You could pronounce his last name. But to me, what really stands out is, in these semifinals and finals, having that supporting cast step up and especially that second midfield for Cornell step up was really notable. And I've thought back to some other championship weekend performances, like one that always stands out in my mind, even 2010. I remember like Crowdy and Quinzani had big semifinals when Duke beat Virginia. But then in the finals, I think Crowdy was held to 1 assist, and I think Quinzani might have been 1 goal, and they grinded out a 6-5 victory, I believe. So to me, you need those games where you can't just count on your star player coming through with all these points. and they certainly did that. Michael Long had a couple nice down shots. The second midfield we talked about, and then that allowed them to power through. And then Kurst truly had a legacy game in the finals, which was cool to see. So that really stood out to me, especially because, again, Penn State played a great game, really good battle all around, a couple bounces here and there, and Cornell squeaks out a 2-goal win.
Yeah, Cornell was not really smooth sailing through. Even the first half of that Albany game was tighter than people thought. They ended up blowing them out. The Richmond game was very tight, came down to the last possession, and then make it to the Final Four. When I was watching Cornell, they looked a little bit off, like playing a little bit tighter. And I think that's primarily, I was looking for Goldstein. I was looking for Kirst. But you walk out of that game with a win. Michael Long, who's been quieter this year relative to his counterparts on attack, he leaves that game with 5 points. Kelleher, who you mentioned, leaves that game with 4 points. So they just found a way to get it done. I don't want to go too far into the national championship game, but going to the second game of the day, honestly, this was never a game. Maryland wins 14-8. Syracuse scored the first goal of the game, and that was really the last time that Syracuse had like any real momentum. Maryland dominated from the start. They went up 8-2 at half. I think you just have to tip your cap to John Tillman and to the Maryland guys that are just so bought into whatever he's preaching. And, Matt, you can talk about that a little bit, but just, anecdotally from being there and watching Maryland play in person, like the way that they play offense, I just found so impressive. Like they're so disciplined. Those guys keep the ball on their stick for, 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 seconds, and they move it, right? They're not forcing things. They're wearing the defense down. Some people in the stands were saying, oh, this is like boring. I'm like, it's really not. Like, this is some good offense. A guy that really stood out to me, just seeing him in person for the first time, was Zach Whittier, 13. He was, had no problem with a lot of the short sticks and just makes the right play. I don't think he left the game with any points. So he's 0-0, but he was super impactful. McNaney, I think what was so impressive with him, he's making save after save, but he's also catching the ball cleanly, whether it's at his stick high or if he's making an off-stick hip save. And I think that is just really detrimental to shooters, right? You could then tell Syracuse is really overthinking a lot of their shots. So great performance from Maryland and John Tillman again.
Yeah, I would just say, echoing that, it's also very interesting. Like, I would say, thinking back to Maryland in 2022, where, we made a video a while ago about, hey, is this one of the greatest offenses ever? I don't know that the offense and the scheme has really changed that much, but what I think is really hard just in general is having enough guys that win one-on-one matchups. It just shows, like, even guys going against short sticks, like, it's not easy to consistently run by your guy, and most teams like maybe have 1 or 2 guys that can do that, but it's not like these huge amount of numbers, So I think sometimes some of the Maryland offensive guys that like aren't their top guys maybe receive some negative criticism around like winning matchups, or they're like playing slow. But honestly, I just think, like, if you look at any, Division One offense, like who has, 3, 4, 5 guys that are consistently running by matchups on the first or the second unit. So I just think, like, again, like when they have more of those guys, like when they had a Wisnauskas that had a Twarton type of year, like it all clicked, and it came together. But they're still doing a lot of the things really well. And then I think just, again, like if they had a few more possessions, again, we'll talk about the finals, but again, like they did a nice job overall. And, even again, talk about some second midfield production, both stepping up and showing some promise, I think gives Terps fans more to be excited about in the future too.
Yeah, and I got to catch, the first half live, and then we actually had practice towards the second half, so we're getting score updates on the field, but fortunately, it was never that close. I think it's Logan saving the ball at 67% is a huge deal, and that's probably they graduate a few guys. That's probably the biggest piece because we've talked about it before, but they play very complimentary lacrosse around trusting that their goalie can see and save certain shots. Not that Logan's not making some really tough saves, because he did, but I do think there's an element to, like, if we can give Logan these shots, like, he's going to save a high clip of them and we can get sticks and gloves and all those things. I think the ability to, Maryland finds different ways to generate offense. Like AJ Larkin had 2 goals in that game. I think as a build off of Logan being able to catch and get the ball out quickly allows them to counterattack. I do think it'll be interesting seeing and we can talk more about Maryland and the championship stuff too, how this team evolves next year because you do return a lot. So now expectations are pretty high on a unit that really didn't have expectations this year, and none of these names were supposed to be all that much. And I think in the championship game, you kind of saw the lack of ability to have a guy aside from Eric Spanos that really can win a lot of individual matchups and put pressure on the defense, like maybe some guys on like a Cornell or even a Cuse at times could.
Yeah, I love how Maryland, how it's like low expectations. It's like, how can we keep doing that to Maryland, like in any capacity? Like that Tillman can advance with, it seems like, any roster. And their roster is also really good, right? Like they're all top 6 guys have over 30 points. Like their top midfield, I think they're like 33, 33, and 31. Like those are also legit numbers in the Big Ten from the midfield. Like I know that's not a 45 or 50 point season, but with the schedule they play, that's very solid. I guess that leads us to the national championship game, Cornell against Maryland. These are two teams that actually play each other in the fall a lot. It's a big fall ball matchup and they rotate locations. So I was excited just for kind of some of that history that they have there. Also, John Tillman's a Cornell alum. Connor Busick, obviously also a Cornell alum. Cornell won this game 13-10. CJ Kirst, 6-1. Ryan Goldstein, 4 goals. The two of them really just dominated. I got the chance to watch this whole game, not in person. I watched it on TV. Maryland, honestly, I just thought they looked like a step slower than they did on Saturday. I didn't think they actually deemed to what you were saying. I thought offensively, and I would love to kind of hear your input. I thought they weren't able to get it like a step or two, like they were getting on Syracuse on a lot of those D mids. Like I didn't think they were moving, the Cornell defense great. And, also credit to Cornell's defense and their short sticks. I thought they did a great job. And then I think really uncharacteristic, but obviously that fourth quarter, I think a lot of the storyline is just some of those failed clears that Maryland had, which you really never see from John Tillman's team. So great win. Not the biggest Cornell fan, obviously big rivalry with Syracuse, but ton of respect for them getting over the hump. They haven't won since the 70s. Busick, Jordan Stevens, Paul Safari, those are 3 of the best guys and coaches. Really cool for them. Really cool for all the Cornell alumni and their faithful. Like their tailgate, their fans, incredible, right? They all came out to support, and they do for every game. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts here.
I love when you go on your rants. Gets me fired up. I do agree. I did feel like in the finals, their offense, Maryland's offense, had to work so much harder to generate quality shots. And I think you saw less quality shots produced. And then it kind of felt like when they got them, they weren't as comfortable, weren't as like situated to really put a good attempt on net. I also think I saw some of this from Larkin Kemp, but he did make a good point where the goalie battle was a lot more even than people probably would have expected. Nust and Cage, less talked about, like solid goalie, really stepped up. And I think he minimized what people thought would be a large experience gap between like him and McNaney playing. So I think that was huge for Cornell in limiting some of those extra chances if they did get them.
I think this is a game where you really saw both teams are tired. It's the second game of championship weekend where you just saw not only experience, but just like individual talent take over. I thought Cornell's defensive game plan was good against Maryland, which was, hey, play pretty tight. They did pack it in, and Maryland didn't have a ton of guys with range. And I think early on you saw some shots that were maybe a bit outside of guys' ranges or not the typical Maryland shot you see. I think where you look at what Maryland was able to do and Coach Tillman over the season and Coach Bernhardt and Coach Phipps was kind of get the most out of all these guys where you're playing great team defense. Will Schaller had an incredible season and, Kirst goes 6-1, but like, I still think Will Schaller played overall a pretty good game. They just Kirst finds different ways to score and make plays. But you see a guy like Goldstein where like Maryland probably on paper didn't have like all these cover guys, but they played great defense all year where they could play good position. They could support the right way. And I just think in this game, you saw like that show where you have guys like Kirsten Goldstein, where like 2 really elite unassisted goal scorers, with Goldstein off the end line a few times, like his ability to drive up to his left-hand score top side question mark. And I mean, honestly, like, Canfield and Peter Lake, like I'm watching, like they're playing pretty good defense on almost any other guy, but it's just a really good take and a really good goal. That puts a lot of pressure on your defense when like you have guys that are able to do that, kind of stepping into the moment. You didn't really have a great semifinal game like we talked about. And I think just being able to capitalize and mentally get over that hump is where you saw guys like him in the chaos of the game when everybody's tired, like just make the plays that were needed, and where maybe Maryland didn't have that as much. You maybe saw some of those guys that were a little tired, a little flustered at the end of the game, throw the ball away on a clear, where Kirsch was creating, or their Cornell attacks creating havoc and riding it back. That's what it felt like there was this deterioration to me. And like the fact that Kirsch got going was kind of in everybody's heads, and it generated a ton of momentum. Imagine the energy that gives a Cornell team, knowing your best player is a broken hand and is still able to produce like this and playing as hard as he was playing.
How many teams have a number 2 attackman that are breaking people down like that? I think that again, like, just becomes this variable where even I just think of very few times in general do I see Maryland get beat for unassisted goals, period. But for it to happen, 3, 4, 5 times, it's kind of one of those where does that happen, 9 out of 10 times? Like, no, that's like a once or twice out of 10. But just hats off to Cornell for like rising to that occasion and doing that, and Goldstein showing that ability to separate and score in multiple ways. Like the inside roll, Matt, you touched on at the top side lefty, and then the question mark, just big time plays. And you just don't see many teams that have multiple guys that can do that to the long sticks, and then have some guys that can contribute against the short sticks up top.
Yeah, it's like a PLL attack line where you have like Sowers and Kieran McCardle, or O'Keefe and Amen and Connor Fields all in a unit or something like that, where you don't see it in college that much. And also very different types of Dodgers too, where like the Goldstein ability to isolate space at X, and Kirsch can play anywhere on the field and different body types and different abilities.
Yeah, and Goldstein, like his footwork, he looks like Michael Sowers out there, right? And he just had 94 points on the season, 43 goals, 51 assists. He's a sophomore. Last year, he was a little bit banged up early. He wasn't even, Willem Firth was Ivy League Rookie of the Year last year, right? That's 2 guys that they have on their offense. They'll be juniors next year. I thought he was phenomenal. And then even just speaking to Kurtz quickly, just because I have to, like, he didn't even have a great first quarter. I was kind of like, wow, is he like in his head? Is there something going on injury wise? And then he just, completely lit it up. And I think one thing that really stood out to me, like his righty low angle finishing ability was incredibly elite, and especially on a goalie like McNaney.
He really put it all together. And it was like, I thought, a masterclass in dodging. He used all the tools between change of direction, change of speed, creating contact, and then deception on the finish. It's really everything you would want to show a young player in terms of how to dodge and how to use your skill set. He did it, and he did it in multiple ways. And a lot of credit to him. It was hard not to root for those guys from my perspective, just from hearing like how they approach things and their mindset. So just for me, when I don't really have a dog in the fight, it's always fun to see teams like that put it all together and have a great performance.
I will say, just to add to that, like obviously I root for Maryland and everything. It's hard not to, but to me, like Cornell had a lot of pressure this year, right? And people assume that when you're like that good, and they were really good, but they weren't like Notre Dame. You weren't like Notre Dame last year, or Maryland in 22, in my opinion, where it was like this kind of running through everybody, even though they only lost one game. Like they grinded out a lot of wins, and they had a really talented offense and really good and well coached defense that I think probably got underappreciated a bit. But what they did, and to me, it comes down to like when we had CJ Kirst and Michael Long on the podcast, those guys talked about the culture, and they talked about like, things that were beyond just like being good at lacrosse, even though that's really important to them and how hard they work. But to have a season like they just had, like culture is such a big part of it. To win a gritty semifinal game and to win that Maryland game, which was by no means a blowout. Like it was not necessarily totally back and forth, but Maryland was always kind of like closing the gap, and to be able to pull away. And even that the Richmond game in the quarterfinals, like there's a big cultural element to that, of guys that are bought in, to guys that are doing beyond just like the stat sheet plays, working really hard. And, you look down the stretch, like Richmond failed some clears against Cornell. Richmond's one of the best clearing teams in the country. Maryland failed clears against Cornell. Maryland's one of the best clearing teams in the country. And why does that happen? Well, it's star attackmen that also like ride their ass off, and guys at the midfield that sub like crazy and bump across the field. And so while I'm obviously bummed that Maryland lost, to me, like Cornell was super talented, but like they also did have a culture that's worth shouting out. And I think, what Coach Busick kind of talked about after the game too, like there's this historic culture at Cornell. And I think we really just got to see that shine with this like unit here.
I love how afterwards, like in every interview, every player and coach, they're all talking about like this is for Cornell. This is about like everyone that came before us. Like it wasn't just about them or and that season, which I think does speak to like the Cornell fandom as a whole and that culture that goes on, even speaking to like the crowd that they had. If you guys are good to switch over just to the women's side, quickly, also at the Final Four was also at Gillette. But on their games are Friday, Sunday. On Friday, UNC beat Florida 20-4, and Northwestern beat BC 12-11. Quickly for this North Carolina game, and Deemer, feel free to chime in whenever here. But Florida went up 4-2 in this game, and UNC ends up winning 20-4. I was in my hotel and I had it on, and Florida was up 4-2. I went out to dinner and I was like, oh, we got to turn the game on the TV. And it was like 10-4. And I was like, oh my God, what happened? UNC just, so impressive. And Chloe Humphrey was so impressive. We can get to UNC again if we're talking about the championship, but flipping over just to that second game, Northwestern 12, BC 11. BC went on a 4-0 run in the third quarter. And then Northwestern went on a 6-0 run in the fourth quarter. That was probably the most exciting women's game of the weekend. Deemer, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think first talking about the first semifinal, I was pretty shocked, to see their performance end to end that UNC put on in that game. Also important to note, 20-7 on draw controls. Winning 20 out of 27 draw controls was massive, and they were just playing make it take it. The way that the UNC offense stepped up against the Florida defense to just open the floodgates, and then UNC did a great job of putting the clamps down on Florida, and just making it really difficult to produce anything. So I really was not expecting a scoring margin of that. I think outside of the championship, maybe one of the next closest games that UNC played was the Clemson game, which was the second round, the first weekend, obviously in conference battle. But, I thought that was interesting to note. Going on game two, I think one thing that I took away and observed from watching Northwestern and watching some social media and, following some of the players that have been to our events, there seemed to be this really cool culture of belief, and, really coming together internally as a team to make a run. And I think that's really evident when you make a 6-goal run in the fourth quarter to win the game. And I think the power of like team and unity and that belief in the greater good and that you're never out of a game, I think that's really special. It's hard to capture, but they clearly did that. And I was surprised that, BC relinquished that. But, Madison Taylor stepped up with a big game. Sam Smith was big on the draw controls. Sammy White, Delaney Schweitzer had some huge saves. It was definitely an exciting game, and hats off to them for advancing to the finals.
Yeah, BC had some good looks at the end. I really felt for Molly Driscoll. I think she's a phenomenal player, so I just want to shout her out. And then even just Delaney Schweitzer had a nice game-winning save, right? So really exciting down to the wire. I think just flipping the script, I think it was Northwestern, I believe in 2022. They were up big on UNC, and UNC had that crazy comeback. I don't think this wasn't like the same type of hype game, right? That comeback was outstanding, but so was this one. And it's nice to see Northwestern be able to flip that script. It's happened to them before, and then they were able to do it. So UNC versus Northwestern. UNC wins this one 12-8. UNC completes the undefeated season. Chloe Humphrey, 4-1. She was named MVP of the tournament. Happy to talk more about her a little bit after, but Deemer, any further thoughts on this game?
I was really intrigued to see what would happen at the draw circle. Northwestern with Sam Smith taking the draws, and then Sammy White and Madison Taylor on the circle. I really thought that was going to be a huge X factor in the game. And again, UNC won 17 out of 24 draw controls. I wanted to highlight Kaylee Harden, who had 6 draw controls in each game of Final Four weekend, as well as grad student Sophie Student, who took the draws. I think she came up with 9 herself. And then freshman Eliza Osborne continued a dominant freshman campaign. She had 8 draw controls over the weekend, along with a handful of goals. And that was just a battle. Seeing some of the best athletes in the sport was exciting to watch. As the game wore on, huge hats off, in defeat to Delaney Schweitzer. I think Delaney had the best game of her career. She had 17 saves. I mean, she was an absolute brick wall and making incredible saves from outside to inside. And, UNC just dominating possession battle and ability to create shots. They were just going to goal and really put on a barrage. So I think again, like it was a great game. The Humphreys sisters, both dominated all weekend, all season. They deserve all the accolades that and attention that they've been getting. It was a fun game to watch because again, you're really seeing some of the best that the sport has to offer.
Guys, quick question. How do draw controls compare to like face-off win percentage, like in women's lacrosse? Is it pretty comparable, like the impact it has on the game, or would you say it's more or less impactful?
I think right now it's still more impactful than men's faceoffs. It seemed like men's faceoffs has declined a little bit in terms of the impact, with some of the shot clock. I'd be happy to be proven wrong if there's like more direct analytics that show the correlation. But in these women's games where teams really start to outwin on the draw circle, another example is UNC in against BC in the finals. I think they won 9 out of 10 draws in the fourth quarter, and were just able to separate. And it's just huge for possession. I think the other thing is whether it's maybe a combination of the longer shot clock, but also sometimes the harder ability in the middle of the field to win the ball back with checks and takeaways and things like that. Like there's certainly a lot of that still, but it's harder to go and manufacture that I think when you get possession, like you're really for a lot of times, like you're earning a true offensive possession. When it's that lopsided, it's usually tipping the scales towards the team that's winning more.
Yeah, and I think it's super important. I think from like the men's side, I feel like faceoffs really took off. Also, just like the focus around it and talking when you had like household type names of Trevor Baptiste and TD, right? They're like Tewarton finalists. They're, on Instagram, on Inside Lacrosse, everything. I don't feel like the women's side has those types of players yet. Maybe people that are like, I mean, there are some specific draw specialists, but it's not as much the norm and like household name type. Also, you really do get three people involved with the ball. You can obviously self draw as well, but I do think it's super impactful and I think it's a trend that's going to continue, where people are going to get more specialized. It's going to become even more popular.
There's a lot of 50-50 balls, and it is such an interesting dynamic to just compare like men's when you're coming in on that consistent wing play all the time versus the women when you're seeing a lot of the gamesmanship of like moving around the circle and the ball is going in all different directions. And I would say like one thing I noticed too, there's certainly some transition off the draw, but it's not as much of like pinch and pop vibe that you see in the men's game. Like it's definitely more of like a possession thing than like quick early offense off the draw, even though you get some of that. Sometimes I wonder too, like it's interesting to see how like why they're playing on a bigger field. Like the field is wider, the field is, I believe it's longer, overall. Sometimes like to me, it also like slows the game down, like in between some of like the 30s and, on the clears and stuff, but it's definitely a huge impact.
One thought is like, without knowing as much as you guys do, obviously, but a men's team wins a face-off, they're going to sub off that whole rope unit probably, versus a women's team wins a draw. Most of those players are staying on to play. Correct. So now you have a longer possession of winning a draw with actually your offensive personnel than you do in the men's game winning a face-off. And because I do think I agree, not that face-offs are unimportant in the men's games, and they certainly at times when you win face-offs down the stretch, like it's huge. But I do think the correlation of what it used to be pre-shot clock of winning a face-off to the win percentage is not as impactful now that possessions are, limited with a shot clock.
The other thing that's also worth noting in terms of strategy is, when you have four defenders, four attackers, and then three people playing in the midfield, you can move a defender or an attacker to the other restraining line. So you can actually have like a lopsided advantage or disadvantage which also is a way that teams will put 5 people in the defensive zone. And if the other team doesn't match that, well, now there's a player advantage for the defense that can kind of stop a lot of that transition too. So it's definitely like, and I don't know how the rules differ now for high school versus younger, like if you can do 6 and 2 or not, but it's always this interesting thing. I think it used to be anyone could go anywhere on the draw before they started like really implementing some structure around the restraining lines. To close out here, really exciting women's season overall. UNC capping off an undefeated season after they were really doubted and caught a lot of criticism last year and also just had a lot of injuries. So they finished up a great season. Madison Taylor had a dominant season for Northwestern, setting the goal scoring record. And we saw more players, even like Rachel Clark, chasing her down the stretch. We saw McKenna Davis set Boston College's assist record. And we saw Ashley Humphrey on UNC also break her own NCAA assist record as well. So a lot of incredible performances. It was an exciting season to watch and cover. And with that, we'll close it out. Guys, let's shift gears here. Everyone's starting to get ready for recruiting and for summer. And the focus this summer really starts to have all the spotlight around a lot of the class of 2027. So today we wanted to talk a little bit about that player's perspective, recruiting for the 2027s. What should you be doing, heading into summer? Last week, we had some awesome webinars with Dartmouth head coach Sean Kerwin, as well as new FCL athlete, coach and mentor Adam Sear, who spent 8+ seasons coaching at the high Division I level. Guys, as we think about this, what are some of the things that you're talking to some of our athletes about?
It's a great question. And I think to a lot of families, like recruiting can feel like a black box a little bit. And there's a lot of different components. So like it's different by the type of school you're interested in, right? If if you're looking at a D3 or an NESCAC school, like that process is much later than if you're looking at a high D1 school and understanding what the journey actually looks like. So one thing that I'm trying to help athletes with and players understand is timeline going into the summer and setting appropriate expectations and like what are things they can actually do right now versus like always feeling like they're not doing the right thing. I think from a timeline perspective, it's understanding some of the key dates. And that is one, like the academies can start contacting and recruiting officially on July 1st, and everybody else starts September 1st. And what that really means is that's the start of the point where schools can contact you and they can make you offers and you can accept those offers. Understanding that before that, the schools are spending a lot of time now getting organized to begin to recruit the 2027 class this summer. And what I mean by schools, it's a lot of the Division I programs, the top Division I programs, where a number of the other programs are still really working on their 2026 classes, and they'll get a feel and fill form lists on the 27s, but they're probably not outreaching to students on September 1st as much. And so really understanding that September 1st date, aside from the academies, which is July 1st, is just the start of the process where coaches can begin to officially reach out, have you come visit and offer you a spot if they're able to or willing to. But that process from September 1st will continue for many athletes beyond the fall, winter into the spring. And it's not all about that like first 3 weeks, which I think there's an impression that like, September, October, or like I'm totally messed up. So just setting the expectations of understanding like what this timeline is like. The coaches are spending this summer recruiting you heavily so they have a good feel for September 1st, but each program will approach the fall differently.
Yeah, I think that's all spot on. One thing that I've found just repeatedly in a couple of my conversations over the last 2 or 3 weeks is focus around the mindset heading into the summer, right? It's no secret. It's a grind. You're going to a ton of events, ton of showcases, prospect days. You're on the road a lot, you're traveling. But one thing that I think can be really helpful is just kind of reframing your mindset when you do go into these events. Like, how lucky are you that, you get all these college coaches to be on your sideline and watch you play? Like, you get to go to tournament after tournament showcase and play in front of the coaches that, you've grown up watching on TV or, you've grown up wanting to go to their school. So it's like finding, instead of being super stressed about it, which is natural, right? Be excited, be thankful, have like a sense of gratitude towards it. So that's something that I think can be helpful. Another thing is just, and we've talked about it a lot, just your compete level, right? Don't get in the car after the event, after the showcase, the prospect day, and have regrets about, your effort or making an impact on the field. I'm not saying you have to score every goal. I'm not saying you have to have every assist, and it's not going to go that way. There's going to be showcases where if you play attack, you're not going to get the ball a lot, right? Or if you're a midfielder, maybe you're going to make mistakes, but walk away from that saying that you did everything that you could, right? Like go after the ground ball, chase the ball off the end line, right? Hustle off the field, clean up, your mess of the water bottles on the bench afterwards. Like do those little things right at all times. And I do think that then the rest of it is really going to take care of itself. The compete level, like, all right, everyone's going to be flying around in the first quarter of the first game on Saturday. But then on Sunday, how are you playing then? Or, in the second half or fourth quarter of your game, how are you playing at that point? Are you still competing? Are you running hard? You're going to be tired, no doubt, right? But run hard. And like I said, just to start off, don't have regrets when you get in the car to go home, right? Everyone's putting too much effort into it. There's too much on the line. So, just play your absolute hardest.
Those are great points. We've had some webinars, we've had discussions with people around having conversations with their players, sons and daughters, like after games. I really feel like unless your son or daughter wants to go into X's and O's and scheme, if they get in the car and you ask them, hey, did you have fun? And did you give 100%? If they answer like those two things, then like that's all you can really ask for, and that should be the focus. How we're framing some of that and how we're having discussions around that can also really impact mindset. It's kind of like, too, touching on your point of gratitude. I think there's obviously with a lot more events and things going on, there becomes a lot of focus on what is happening at each event. What's your team like? What are the kids on your team doing? Who are the coaches there? All these little details. But if you also just try to pull yourself back as a parent and a kid and try to have the gratitude for what you're getting to do and what you do have and what you did get that day, you're just going to be in a lot better of a space, in a lot better of a headspace where you can make this process a lot more enjoyable as opposed to letting yourself get really sucked into the negatives. So it's not something that you just say once and it's fine. It's something that you're going to have to continue to remind yourself as you're getting in the car and you're going down to Delaware and then you're going to Philly and then you're going back to Delaware. It is a grind, but if you have the right mindset, you can stay on track. It can be a really rewarding and fun experience.
Steven, question for you, and Deemer, feel free to chime in as well. How do you set realistic expectations on where you may end up or what schools you should target as a player this summer? I think that's one. They're like, I want to go to these schools. Am I being unrealistic? I don't want to sell myself short, but I also don't want to be emailing the top 5 schools over and over again and then like realize that was really just not really the level I'm at. So how would you recommend a player parent go about like framing expectations appropriately while still being ambitious about, having success?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think it's unique to everyone's situation. I think broadly speaking, first, I think cast a wide net, right? It's totally fine to be emailing schools in the top 5, but also be emailing schools from 30 to 40, right? I'm not saying you have to send out 50 emails, but you can find your different pockets of schools that might fit kind of your needs. I think I'm never the type to shoot anyone's kind of dreams down. If a top 5 is the dream, do whatever it takes to try and get there. Maybe Carolina really likes the way you play or something. Maybe you are at that level. Strive for what your kind of goals have always been and maybe your dreams as a kid. I think what it ultimately comes down to is, having that self-reflection of one, like, what is your film looking like? Like, how are you honestly playing? You got to look at yourself in the mirror. Like, how am I actually playing? What am I good at? What am I not? And I think the summer also provides a time of like, now I see how I stack up against a lot of the players across the country, right? I'm at these showcases, I'm at these tournaments. It's not just my high school. It's not just my high school league. Like, what do I look like compared to the top people? And I think you have to be really honest with yourself and you have to get there pretty early in terms of like being honest with yourself, right? And that can be really hard and people don't want to like hear the truth, but I think that's a good way to see where you are as it equates to the rest of the country. So those are just a couple different thoughts that I have, but ultimately I think casting a wide net is a smart way to go, especially at the start of the summer, and then analyze how things are going. And it's something that you just have to kind of pick your head up out of the sand between each event and be like, all right, where am I? Where am I stacking up? How do I think I am? Instead of doing that come August 15th when all the events are done and now you only have this time until September 1 and you've only emailed, the top 10 schools.
what I think about when I think about the top 10 is they're able to really sit back and in some ways like see which kids really emerge to that level. And then they're going to be really in a lot of ways outside a few of like outliers or like maybe schools that sit in like slightly a different like geographic region, or maybe maybe there's some differences in academics. They're going to be sitting back and really selecting out of a top pool of kids that they think are rising to their level. And then everyone else below that, they'll monitor. Maybe it'll be a wait and see, or hey, we'll just never get there because we have to go with more of the known commodities. And maybe they don't have a spot for a later bloomer. But we've also had a lot of conversations, with coaches, and we've seen stories like Pat Cavanaugh and CJ Kirst and Ryan Goldstein, where there are later bloomers out there, and then those people are finding their way to the one or two schools that's willing to take a chance on them. And then they're finding, that opportunity and then really blossoming and exploding. So I also think it's really smart to take schools, 15 to 50, and like you said, find your pockets and attack more of that mid-level where you're able to like learn more about those and keep your options open. And then if you get recruited up to some of those top schools and that top ACC or Big 10 or Ivy League school comes calling, you're ready to capitalize and jump on that. So I think that that's something that it can be missed, but it's really important because everyone, gets stuck focusing on the same type of dream-like schools.
I had a note here to talk about some of the late bloomers too, because I think that's a big part of it. And there's like, Stephen, what you're talking about, there's one thing that really pops out to me, and it's figuring out like what do you really want, right? Like, and I mean that at like a deeper sense than like the first answer you're going to give on what do you really want. Like, oh, I want to go to a big football school. Like, oh, I want high academics. Like, oh, I want Ivy League. I want this, and everybody has an answer that what they want. You're like, okay, well, I want to go to I want to go to like an Ivy League school. Like, okay, so if you don't get offered by an Ivy League, but Virginia offers you, or you're like, boom, I'll go there. What do you want? I want a big football school. If a great school offers you, would you go? I'd go there. Yeah. Okay. So figure out like what is it that you really want. And it's okay to say, I want to play at the best lacrosse school that will offer me. Like people are like afraid to say that. They think they need to say like academics sometimes or some other thing. Like, but figure out what it is. Cause for me, it was kind of like I wanted to play at the best like lacrosse school that would offer me, and make sure when I visited that I just like liked the feel of it. And I think for the late bloomer piece, right? Like, and I've been kind of thinking about that more and talking to some guys, even at training camp. Like TJ Malone was committed to Amherst, got scooped up by Penn State. He was a late bloomer. I asked Rob Pennell why he went to Cornell, and he goes, well, nobody else recruited me. And so Cornell gave me a shot. So I went. And like, I didn't know that. Like, these are some of the greatest players, in the last couple of decades. And so, what's the theme of like these late bloomers when you talk about Pat Cav, Pat Spencer, CJ Kurse? I mean, I think they love it, right? They're not trying to game it. They're not trying to go to like TJ wasn't trying to go to Amherst so he get poached somewhere else. Like he just wanted to go, like he was going to go play where he could play, and he loved playing. And so, like, I think if you're trying to like game it, you're kind of like trying a shortcut that's really probably not sustainable and probably not going to get you to where what you actually want. So I think figuring out what it is you actually want out of your experience, like what excites you, what would be something that you'd be fired up to be a part of, and like would you actually love it and be enthusiastic about it? And that's something that Coach Kerwin spoke about on our webinar last week, Deemer, talking about like what's important. He's like, well, you gotta love it. There's so much like college lacrosse is really hard. There's a lot that's going to go into it. And if you don't absolutely like love it and are excited about being on the team and like trying to earn playing time and playing for that school at that program, you're probably not going to have success, or at least not enjoy it. And so I think we'll overlook that. It feels like a little obvious, but like all these people that bloom late, like CJ Curse is on the podcast, he loved it. Like he loves lacrosse. Pat Cal was on the podcast. Like he was so determined to get better consistently and to prove that he belonged at like one of those top schools. And it was also like an internal drive to be those things.
There's an element of we can talk about this till we're blue in the face. Parents can try to tell their kids a lot of this too, but it gets to a point where it's only going to click once it clicks for that kid, And I would say the other flip side of this is, I've seen some players put all the time in, put all the effort, do all the travel. And then when those top schools, those true choices aren't working out, they choose to go to a different school, pursue a great education, and they don't play lacrosse anymore. And I think that's really admirable as well. And it's important to remember that lacrosse is not the be all end all. At the end of the day, what everyone as parents, I think, is really solving for is trying to get the best education possible, help your son or daughter get into a great college. And then the rest, once you do that, is kind of like bonus time. You're hoping that your son or daughter has this great experience. But if they can walk out of somewhere with a 4-year degree, a lot of people feel like that's still a great stepping stone. Like if you're trying to inspire your kid to set themselves up for the 40 years after college, hey, let's try to get to the best college that you can. I think when you figure out and you're making some of those decisions, maybe I can play lacrosse here. It's not as high academic of this institution, but like that's my dream. That's what I want to go for. But when people choose to opt out of that, I think that's really respectable too, because look, we grew up in Baltimore. Steve, you were upstate, upstate Connecticut, these areas, like you're surrounded a lot of times by everyone who's playing lacrosse. And it's like, well, what if I don't play? Like, I'm not cool, or I'm not like part of it anymore. But, at some point, you as a person have to be like, this is what I want to do, not just what everyone else in town is doing. And that's what I should do too.
I see that more now coaching in Dallas, where I've had a number of kids that one of them is like a really good defender who's committed Bucknell. And he's like, I just want to go to Arkansas. And it was like kind of tough for me as a coach coming from the East Coast, like Deemer, to your point, like we all just like we wanted to play Division I lacrosse. And I was like, are you sure? And like he was like, no, I love playing high school lacrosse. He's like, I just don't want to play in college. And I'm like, that's actually a better answer than going and like hating the fall and being the guy that feels so miserable through it. I do think I've seen guys where maybe they chose not to end up playing, but they tried for a long time. And I kind of sense that it wasn't what they're really fired up about. Because I also coach other kids where and work with other players where I can tell like they're just so excited and ambitious. Like the season ends and they're like, hey, I'm getting my lifting program to like, I'm going to college this fall and I really want to make an impact off the start. And like it's just something that's like intrinsically motivating to them. And to your point, like college lacrosse is not for everybody, and that's not a bad thing. Like those players are probably going to get really fired up by something else at a school or a different program or a different career. And so I do think finding, like for me, it was lacrosse. Like that's what got me really excited. But if it's not that thing, like I think that's totally okay. And to your point, Deemer, even admirable to have the courage to just admit that, like, even though I've done all this and I loved it, it doesn't take away from the experience you've had to high school or through that point. Like I've done it and now I'm excited about this next chapter.
Guys, I want to pull this discussion a little bit back towards timeline and talk a little bit about, emails and some things to do heading into summer. Matt mentioned July 1st as the first contact point for academies. That is your rising junior summer, going into your junior academic year. And then September 1 for Division I schools, they can contact, you can have visits, and everything really opens up after September 1st of your academic junior year. For Division II and Division III, schools can email and call at any time. Division III cannot have official visits on campus until January 1 of your academic junior year. And I believe that Division II can have official visits starting June 15th going into your academic junior year. Worth looking up between the NCAA guidelines, and NCSA usually has some good bullet points around timeline. What we've seen a lot too is, again, as the shift happens now for going into junior year, 27s are the focus of recruiting. There are still some 2026 spots available. Coaches are waiting on the House NIL settlement for firmer decisions around roster spot implementation. So that's created some overhang for the class of 2026. We will see for 26s, a lot of academic pre-reads get announced on July 1st this summer going into the 2026, going into their senior years. So you'll start to see a lot of verbal commitments for the Division III level. And then Division II, there's some schools that have been aggressive committing players in the class of 2026, but we also see a lot of that late summer and senior fall for the Division II landscape, at least on the men's side. I think, the high academic D3 women's side is very similar to the men's side in terms of those pre-reads on July 1st going into senior year. But just wanted to try to lay some of that stuff out there, for the different levels. We've done some recruiting seminars for some clubs recently as well, where we've talked about some of this. And now, guys, maybe one of you can touch on it, but kind of this end of season, early summer wrap up where recruits can be sending emails with updated highlight tapes and maybe some scheduling going into summer. Guys, any thoughts on that?
There's a lot of questions around email strategy, highlight tapes, all of that. When we talk to these college coaches, we kind of learned that everybody refers to college coaches as like this one entity. They all have different preferences in how you cut up a highlight tape to a degree and email strategy. So there's not one perfect way to do it. What I would recommend is putting together tape from your spring season and using email as a touch point to try to create some name recognition with coaches and where you're going to be that summer. So create your list once again, figure out the schools you're really interested in, craft an email for them. In that email, you probably want to include things like all of the events you're playing in that summer, the team you're playing in them with, contact points with those coaches, your highlight tape of spring, probably your most recent from spring. And if you have a prior one, you can include both, and also a transcript, just so coaches, some schools right away will rule you in or out based off grades and transcripts. So if you want to just be consistent and get them all of those things, I think that's a great start to email. One thing we always advise, if there's like a handful of schools that you're really interested in and you think those are reasonable fits, is really making those emails feel even more personal and explaining in a few sentences why you're interested in the schools. Maybe it's a parent that went to that school. Maybe you're a huge fan your whole life growing up, because recruiting is a two-way street where that might even build some more resonance in a coach's mind. So once again, not a perfect strategy, but I do think it's important going into summer, getting organized, getting an email out to those coaches with your main information.
Yeah, I think, and then last thing that I would just add in, try and make yourself stand out in whatever way. If you're a 3-sport athlete, make sure you include that. If you have really high grades, if you've already taken your ACT or SAT, like try and differentiate yourself why you're a different person. Everyone has their superpower. You kind of just have to find it and let that coach know. You can only put so much in an email, but I do think that stuff is important too.
Yeah. And I think, throughout the summer, if that's what you're doing right now going into the summer, Coach Kerwin mentioned, like, you don't have to email us, like, if the field you were supposed to play on changed and little things like that. Like, they don't need an email every day from you. But if you want consistent touch points and that feels natural to you, maybe, hey, coach, I saw you were going to be at this tournament, or hey, coach, I saw you at the tournament last weekend, or hey, I got to meet you quickly. Like, it was great connecting with you. We talked about this briefly. Or I'm considering that my coach said I should look at the prospect day for Harvard. Just wanted to let you know that I'm considering coming to the one in July. I hope to see you there. There's ways to continuously do those touch points throughout the summer without spamming every week, but maybe a cadence, one or two a month, some of the schools in June and July. And if anything major changes, like, oh, I'm actually adding a tournament, or I have some new film, things like that can be natural ways to get more emails out. Don't be discouraged if you don't get a response. These coaches are super busy. It doesn't mean they don't see it. So just understand that. And if you're able to communicate with a mentor, a high school coach, a club coach, and say, hey, I'm emailing these 20 schools. I'm really interested in these 10 the most. Like, anybody you think I should include? Anybody I'm being unrealistic about? That's helpful guidance too, just to make sure you're really calibrating around a target that makes a lot of sense.
All really helpful information. And for those that haven't seen, if you have more questions around the recruiting process, or you're thinking about, you're a year out and you're trying to get more information as a parent, we've put together a recruiting course that has been really well received. It's simple, it's low cost, easy to access on our website. So feel free to check that out. Or if you're looking for more of a one-off personal recruiting consultation, we've been starting to do those more consistently as well. So guys, with that, we'll wind down this week's podcast. Exciting Final Four, exciting championship games, a lot to look forward to. Looking forward to an exciting summer ahead.
Awesome, guys. Great job.
All right. See ya.